and former English people, we now learn that the Sussexes have a new rule that if there is a photo taken that shows Harry's bald spot, you know, the one we all know is there already.
Prince Harry's recent public appearances and interviews. Side-by-side archival footage of Harry over time, British royal correspondent debate panels, paparazzi and press photography analysis segments, archive footage of royal walkabouts and press pools, studio discussions on image management and public scrutiny. It was never announced, it was never acknowledged, but royal photographers noticed it first. As new images of Prince Harry circulated, something else began circulating behind the scenes. Claims that appearance management around Harry had quietly intensified. Camera angles, lighting requests, positioning protocols. What once passed unnoticed was now, according to insiders, treated as sensitive.
Now, Esther, there's always keen eyes watching public figures, and someone has apparently noticed that Harry's hair looked different in Singapore to a recent photo shoot. Tell me it's just the lighting.
Not a scandal, not a crisis, but a vulnerability, managed with the same discipline as any other risk. Today, we examine how an image became a pressure point, why insecurity became strategic, and how a personal detail was elevated into an operational concern within Team Sussex. It began with a set of images that editors did not expect to matter. A routine appearance, standard lighting, a familiar press pen. Yet within hours, picture desks were quietly circulating notes. The angle was different. The crop was tighter. The focus lingered just long enough for comparison to begin. For Prince Harry, comparison is not abstract. It is inherited. Photographers have tracked him since childhood, and they know what to look for. This time, the commentary did not center on clothing or expression. It centered on the crown of his head, a thinning area, visible in high-resolution frames, magnified by overhead lighting and unforgiving lenses.
Oh no, I mean, come on. No guessing it's not Meghan who's made this dictate. I mean, seriously. Is there nothing this woman won't stoop to?
I thought he was already bald, to be perfectly honest, but...
Online reaction followed the familiar arc. First observation, then exaggeration, then mockery. None of it was new. What was new, according to sources close to the Sussex operation, was how quickly the response shifted behind the scenes. Within days, entertainment desks reported subtle changes, requests for altered camera positions, preference notes sent to event organizers, movement protocols that placed Harry slightly forward or under a softer light. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest that a personal detail had crossed into operational concern. The language used internally surprised some observers. Security-style phrasing applied to something cosmetic. Avoid overheads, control angles, minimize exposure. The words were familiar to anyone who has managed risk. The subject was not. This is where tension formed. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was markedly different. Palace aides, according to royal correspondents with long access, dismissed the chatter as overinterpretation. Senior staff pointed to precedent. Appearance changes happen. Public figures age. The institution does not manage hairlines. That position split opinion. One camp inside royal circles argued that image obsession invites ridicule. The more tightly something is controlled, the more attention it draws. They cited Prince William, who openly addressed his hair loss years earlier, but then ignored it. Normalization, they argued, drains the story of oxygen. The opposing camp believed the Sussex environment was different. Outside institutional protection, image equals leverage. In California, optics are currency. A single viral image can define a narrative cycle. From that perspective, managing vulnerability was not vanity. It was defense. The antagonist structure emerged quietly. On one side stood relentless scrutiny, amplified by digital culture and royal comparison. On the other stood a team determined to minimize a detail they believed was being weaponized. Between them stood Harry himself, caught between wanting indifference and feeling exposed. The human element mattered most here. Friends and former colleagues described Harry as sensitive to physical comparison, particularly when it intersected with public narratives about aging and masculinity. That sensitivity is not unique. What made it combustible was scale. Millions of eyes, endless replay, commentary that treats bodies as public property. Media panels began to debate tone. Some criticized the fixation as cruel and trivial. Others argued that public figures invite scrutiny and cannot curate reality. Both positions missed the quieter story, not whether the bald spot existed, but how it was being handled. Visuals reinforced the shift. At subsequent appearances, Harry was positioned slightly off-center. Group photos placed him in the front rows, where depth softened contrast. Indoor events favored warmer lighting. None of this was confirmed on the record. Editors noticed anyway. Dates and places added texture. A charity appearance in early spring. A panel discussion weeks later. The pattern held. The changes were consistent enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Meanwhile, palace photographers continued their usual approach. No requests, no adjustments. The contrast was stark. Two royal adjacent operations handling the same human reality in opposite ways. One normalized, one managed. That contrast fed commentary about insecurity. Supporters pushed back. They argued that protecting mental well-being includes managing triggers, especially after years of hostile coverage. Critics countered that elevating a cosmetic issue to operational priority signaled fragility. The debate hardened because both sides believed they were defending dignity. The pressure intensified when side-by-side images circulated comparing Harry and William at similar ages. The frames were not neutral. They were curated to invite judgment. Editors insisted they were responding to audience interest. Audience interest insisted it was being fed. Inside the Sussex camp, according to sources, the concern was not vanity but narrative drift. Once a visual becomes shorthand, it overtakes substance. A thinning crown becomes a punchline. A punchline becomes a frame. The team's fear was not hair loss, it was a reduction. Palace advisors watching the coverage warned quietly that overcorrection can backfire. History shows that attempts to suppress minor details often inflate them. The advice did not land. The Sussex operation, accustomed to operating without institutional buffers, leaned into control. That choice widened the rift between approaches. As the cycle continued, something else happened. The story stopped being about hair. It became about what the response revealed. Insecurity versus confidence. Control versus acceptance. Autonomy versus tradition. Each frame carried judgment. Harry's demeanor at events was parsed accordingly. Was he relaxed or guarded? Laughing or managing? The same expression was read differently depending on the viewer's belief. That is the danger of symbolic narratives. They recruit everything into their service. No statement addressed the issue. None was expected. Silence, however, did not equal absence. It allowed the pattern to speak for itself. By the end of this phase, the whisper had become a working assumption in some corners of the press. Not that Harry was losing hair. That was obvious. But that his team had decided it mattered enough to manage like risk. A personal detail had crossed a line, not into scandal, but into strategy. And once strategy enters the picture, scrutiny does not fade. It sharpens. The shift became easier to spot once people knew where to look. It was not one instruction or one moment, but a pattern repeated across appearances. At indoor events, lighting rigs were adjusted subtly. At outdoor engagements, positions were negotiated so that Harry stood a fraction forward, away from harsh midday glare. To casual observers, nothing looked unusual. To photographers, it looked deliberate. Sources familiar with the Sussex operation described the change as practical rather than obsessive. The explanation offered privately was simple. High-definition cameras punish overhead light. Viral clips flatten nuance. Once a detail becomes a punchline online, it can eclipse everything else. The goal, they said, was to keep the focus where it belonged. Inside Team Sussex, that rationale hardened into protocol. Appearance planning meetings began to include language more commonly associated with security briefings. Exposure, risk windows, mitigation. None of this appeared in public schedules, but those who worked events noticed the coordination. Camera lines were suggested, stage heights adjusted, seating plans refined. A personal detail had been elevated to a factor in logistical decisions.
Second, the 900,000 watt floodlights shining down on an ever-increasing bald spot.
That elevation created friction. Across the Atlantic, aides at Buckingham Palace watched with a mix of skepticism and concern. According to royal correspondents with long access, senior staff viewed the adjustments as unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. The institution's philosophy has long been that normalization deflates scrutiny. You do not manage away human realities. You absorb them. This difference in philosophy divided palace opinion. One group argued that the Sussex approach reflected the pressures of operating outside institutional protection. Without a permanent press office buffering every narrative, they reasoned, controlling variables becomes essential. The other group warned that such control invites exactly the attention it seeks to avoid. Once photographers sense sensitivity, they push harder. The comparison that kept resurfacing was unavoidable. Prince William had confronted the same physical change years earlier. He did not adjust the lighting. He did not reposition. He joked once, then moved on. The story died. For palace traditionalists, this was proof that indifference works. Supporters of Harry countered that the environments were not comparable. William operates within a rigid institutional frame where optics are stabilized by routine. Harry does not. His appearances are episodic, his coverage more volatile. A single, unflattering frame can dominate a cycle. From that perspective, mitigation was not vanity. It was damage control. The antagonist structure sharpened. On one side stood the digital ecosystem, eager to reduce complex people to memes. On the other stood a team trying to deny that ecosystem its easiest hook. In the middle stood Harry, increasingly aware that his body was being discussed more than his work. The human cost surfaced in subtle ways. Friends described him as oscillating between irritation and resignation. He wanted to ignore it. He could not. Each new clip brought another wave of commentary, often cruel, sometimes playful, always relentless. It is one thing to age in private. It is another to do so under global magnification. Media panels seized on the tension. Some framed the protocols as evidence of insecurity. Others framed them as a reasonable response to harassment. The debate grew louder because it touched a nerve. Aging is universal. Mockery is not evenly distributed. Visual analysis segments began appearing on late-night programs. Side-by-side frames, freeze frames, arrows. The very techniques that created the problem were now being justified as commentary. Editors insisted they were responding to audience interest. Audience interest insisted it was being manufactured.
But his hair has also been filled out, and it's noticeably very fake. You can see quite obviously the airbrushing at the top. He kind of looks ridiculous. I'm not sure he was behind this. I'm pretty sure he didn't ask for this because
At events in California, the contrast with palace practice became more pronounced. Lighting designers noted requests for warmer tones. Photographers noticed angles that minimized overhead exposure. None of this violated any rules. All of it signaled awareness. That awareness, ironically, fed the story. Inside palace circles, advisors worried about precedent. If cosmetic details are treated like vulnerabilities, where does it stop? Height, weight, wrinkles. The monarchy has survived centuries by refusing to litigate bodies. The Sussex approach, they argued, risked collapsing that boundary. Team Sussex saw it differently. They argued that refusing to acknowledge how images are weaponized is naive in a digital economy. They were not trying to erase reality. They were trying to prevent reduction. The fear was not hair loss. It was being defined by it. That fear intensified when commentary began linking the issue to masculinity and rivalry. Online threads compared brothers relentlessly, often with a cruelty that surprised even seasoned observers. The thinning crown became shorthand for decline. Decline became metaphor. Metaphor became judgment. Harry's reactions were read through that lens. A guarded posture was seen as insecurity. A laugh was seen as deflection. Neutral expressions were treated as confirmation. The story had become self-sustaining. No one addressed it publicly. No aide briefed on record. Silence held. But silence did not mean stillness. Behind the scenes, the protocols remained. By the end of this phase, the conversation had shifted again. It was no longer about whether Harry was losing hair. That was accepted. It was about what the response said about power, control, and vulnerability in a life lived on display. For palace traditionalists, the lesson was cautionary. Overmanagement breeds obsession. For the Sussex team, the lesson was equally stark. In an unforgiving media landscape, ignoring a vulnerability does not make it disappear. Two approaches, one body, endless lenses. And with each appearance, the stakes rose. By the time the conversation reached its third turn, it had drifted far from the photographs that sparked it. What people were now debating was not a thinning crown, but what happens when a personal vulnerability is treated like an operational problem. The scrutiny had changed shape. It was no longer curious. It was diagnostic. For Prince Harry, the pressure came from two directions at once. On the surface, there was the noise. Jokes, memes, side-by-side images. Beneath that sat something quieter and more corrosive. The sense that a small human change was being used to define him. Friends described moments of irritation that gave way to resignation. He wanted to focus on work. The lens kept drifting back. Inside Team Sussex, according to people familiar with the approach, the concern shifted from appearance to consequence. Advisors worried that once a visual shorthand takes hold, it crowds out everything else. Causes blur. Messages flatten. A person becomes a symbol, and symbols are easier to attack than people. From that perspective, managing angles and light was not about hiding. It was about refusing reduction. That rationale clashed head-on with a different tradition. At Buckingham Palace, the long view prevailed. Palace aides argued that bodies change, and the institution survives by refusing to dramatize that truth. The palace has seen kings age in public, queens gray on camera, princes lose hair and gain lines. The rule has been consistent: do nothing special, let familiarity dull the edge. That difference hardened into a philosophical split. One camp believed the Sussex team was overcorrecting, turning a minor issue into a signal that something was wrong. Overmanagement, they warned, trains photographers to hunt. The other camp believed indifference was a luxury afforded by institutional insulation. Outside that shelter, images travel faster and hit harder. Ignoring a vulnerability, they argued, does not neutralize it. It hands it over to the loudest voices. The antagonist structure settled into place. On one side stood an ecosystem that rewards mockery and repetition. On the other stood a team attempting to shape conditions without acknowledging the fight. In the middle stood Harry, increasingly aware that how he was seen mattered more than what he said. Public reaction fractured along predictable lines. Some viewers expressed empathy, noting that hair loss is universal and that ridicule is unnecessary. Others mocked the idea of top security over something so common, framing the protocols as evidence of fragility. The same facts produced opposite conclusions, depending on the audience's starting point. The comparison that never went away remained Prince William. Analysts replayed his approach endlessly. Acceptance, a single joke, then silence. The story died. For critics of the Sussex strategy, this was proof that normalization works. For defenders, it ignored context. William's environment absorbs and diffuses. Harry's amplifies. The human cost became clearer as the cycle wore on. Event planners noticed Harry withdrawing slightly from informal photo moments, not refusing, just less available, a fraction more guarded. The cameras noticed that too. Guardedness became another data point in the narrative of insecurity, even when it was likely self-protection. For Meghan Markle, the issue intersected with a broader instinct to protect. Commentators speculated about her role as strategist, as buffer, one as advocate for controlling variables in an unforgiving space. Supporters saw care. Critics saw curation. Both readings coexisted because no one corrected either. Media analysts warned that treating perception as a battlefield carries risk. The more energy spent managing optics, the more optics dominate. The line between prudence and preoccupation is thin. Cross it, and the story stops being about what is shown and starts being about why it is managed. That warning echoed quietly in palace circles. Advisors feared a self-fulfilling loop. Sensitivity invites attention. Attention invites escalation. Escalation confirms sensitivity. Breaking the loop requires either radical transparency or total indifference. Anything in between feeds the cycle. Team Sussex chose the middle. They did not deny. They did not explain. They adjusted. And adjustment, when noticed, became the story. By the end of this phase, the conversation had reached a strange place. The bald spot itself barely mattered. What mattered was what people believed it represented: aging, rivalry, control, vulnerability. Each viewer projected a meaning that said more about them than about Harry. No statement arrived to end the speculation. None was expected. Silence, again, was the chosen response. But silence does not stop interpretation. It only limits rebuttal. What lingered was a pattern. A personal change was noticed. A defensive response is inferred. A strategic frame applied. From there, judgment flowed easily. In a culture that treats visibility as ownership, even the most ordinary human shifts can be elevated into symbols. For Harry, the cost was not mockery alone. It was the narrowing of how he was seen. When a single visual begins to overshadow intent, advocacy, and history, it becomes a cage of perception. That is the risk when vulnerability becomes strategy. The strategy may work in the short term, but it teaches the audience where to look. And once they are taught, they rarely stop looking. The lenses will move on eventually. They always do. But until they do, the question remains unresolved. Is control protection, or is it confirmation that the thing being controlled matters more than it should? In the end, that question says less about hair and more about life under constant watch, where nothing is just personal, and even the smallest change can become a story no one asked to tell. In royal life, nothing stays small for long. Subscribe, like, and share for deeper investigations into image, pressure, and how even personal details can become strategic concerns inside the modern monarchy.